Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is about to start. Please take your seat. Please take your seat. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's past 12 o'clock, so I can wish you already a good afternoon. And I would like to welcome you to our panel on humanitarian assistance in jeopardy. It's a bit difficult to say that we have a wonderful panel with this extremely sad topic, the humanitarian assistance in jeopardy. But still, it's wonderful for two reasons. First, we have absolutely wonderful panelists, and I'm really very happy to have the honor of moderating a little bit our debate for the next 60 minutes. But also, it is wonderful to put this topic on the agenda, because there's too much acceptance of the facts, too much acceptance of human suffering, as if we couldn't do anything about it, as if we couldn't be better in the way how and where we deliver not only humanitarian assistance, but how we look into the needs of people in the crisis. We're speaking often about crisis as a security matter, as a foreign policy matter, as a matter of international cooperation, yes, but ultimately there are people who are suffering, people who are dying, hopes that are being destroyed, lives that have few chances. And that is, I think, which we should remember, not only on Sunday mornings, but also in our day-to-day work. And I hope we can shed some more light on that, not only in the way of describing what the facts are, because we are at an expert conference, you know the facts, but also finding approaches, avenues, possibilities to how we could increase the effectiveness of what we're doing on the humanitarian side, but perhaps also beyond. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you here. My name is Michael Köhler. I'm a former EU official, Director General for Humanitarian Aid for some years, but now I'm working as a Grand Bargain Ambassador, which is the international process to render humanitarian aid more efficient and effective. I'm very happy to welcome my colleagues here on the panel, starting with the ladies. Sara Pantuliano comes to us, well, I would say from London, but she comes from Salerno, so she has a very strong Italian touch, obviously. Sara is not only the executive director of ODI, of the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI Global, in London, therefore perhaps the most renowned think tank in development and humanitarian studies worldwide. But she also has a long academic curriculum. She studied and did a PhD at the University of Leeds in international and in politics and international studies. And she has been with ODI for quite some years, inter alia also as director in a previous incarnation for the humanitarian program of ODI. So Sarah, very much welcome. I'm very happy that you're on the panel. And you will be assisted by David Harland, sitting next to you, who is a New Zealander, but living in Geneva, so he knows a couple of words in French in the meantime. I always admired David for his very strong interest in the history of the Crusades, but this is not what we're going to discuss here. David obviously is the executive director of CHD, the Center on Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, which a post that he has since 2011. He has a PhD from Fletcher School of Diplomacy, has a master of Harvard in Eastern Asian Studies, so he has the full academic background, but he has even more the practical background in international mediation, but also the humanitarian dimension of conflict management. So very much welcome to David. We have next to David, Karl Skau. Karl, who is the Deputy Executive Director and COO of the World Food Programme here in Rome. Before that, he was head of multilateral affairs in the Swedish Foreign Ministry. He's a seasoned Swedish diplomat who always shifted between the UN and the national service. And he is definitely the practitioner among the people here on the panel. He has been to Gaza 3 times since 7 October, the World Food Programme being one of the major agencies that provide assistance there. So very much welcome to Karl. And absolutely not least, we have Paul Richard Gallagher, who is the Vatican Secretary of Relations with States. Bishop Gallagher is an even more seasoned diplomat, I think, in terms of length of service in the diplomacy of the Holy See. If I'm well informed, you are a diplomat of the Holy See since 1984. You have been apostolic nuncio in a number of countries, but also some countries that are definitely marked by humanitarian crises, like Burundi, like Guatemala. You definitely, from your position, have lots of contacts with the Middle East, but I think you can also bring us the more general view about the humanitarian system, and maybe also what religious organizations, faith-based organizations, in particular, of course, the Catholic Church, can contribute in order to give better access to the people who are in need and who need humanitarian assistance to survive. So, wonderful panel. And what we would like to do is that we proceed from the specific to the general. We would like to have a first round of exchanges on the crisis in Gaza, in particular the humanitarian crisis, then speak a little bit more about the regional dimension, and then later perhaps draw some conclusions on humanitarian issues in times of global fragmentation. Once again, our panel is called Humanitarian in Jeopardy. And what is this jeopardy? What is the risk? What is the danger? It would be too short to think that we only have funding problems. The funding problems are gigantic. They will be getting worse in 2025, according to everything we can forecast already. But this is not the only problem. There's also blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. There is, if you can say that, a dehumanization of conflict, and therefore ever bigger losses in human lives of civilians, but also ever bigger rate, and to be protected. And this is not new. This has not started with Gaza. Think of what happened in northern Syria. Think of what we are seeing every day in Sudan, in the east of Congo, and many other conflicts in the world. But I wanted to ask Carl in the beginning, because of your first-hand experience in Gaza, to explain to us what is WFP's role right now in Gaza? What are the problems that you are encountering? Can you bring in the supplies? What happens with the supplies once they crossed into the Gaza Strip? What are the day-to-day challenges for WFP's contribution to humanitarian relief in Gaza? Carl.
Thanks, Michael, and really thanks for this opportunity to be with you here. You know, on Gaza, we were the second largest agency in Gaza already before the war, assisting some 350,000 people, mainly through cash programs. And of course, following the war, we stepped up quickly. Between UNRWA and ourselves, we've divided the population basically in half. So our aim was to support some 1.1, 1.2 million people on a monthly basis. You know, we geared up quickly to have the capacity to do so. Over the first 6 months, the big challenge was really to get assistance to the border and to get that assistance across the border. I think many of you followed the discussions back in those days, including how to screen what to be able to bring across, the big queues that were lining up, not least in Egypt. So by mid-spring, we had a terrible humanitarian situation in Gaza because the lack of assistance coming in. And we raised alarm through what is called the IPC system, the independent body that looks at famine conditions. So we raised alarm loudly in April around the risk of a famine in Gaza. I think that partly helped to begin opening up. We managed to open up Ashdod port in Israel. There was an opening in the north of a gate called Eretz, and we began to be able to move a lot more assistance in through Kerem Shalom, the opening also in the south. And before the Rafah operation also, there was more entry in through the Rafah border. So I would say that around May, June, we were able to step up operations, and we were reaching beyond 1 million people on a monthly basis. And I think that in that period also, we managed to somewhat stabilize access to basic food commodities. I mean, that doesn't mean that people are well off. Still, dramatic needs around water and sanitation, not least, but also basic healthcare, of course, and just the general living conditions at that time still very dire. So, come August, September, we felt that we had found a modus that somewhat worked. Now, the past couple of months have been severely different. We have backtracked in a quite radical way. First, the commercial flows that were beginning to come up has come back down like we have not seen since the start of the war, basically. This is due to the Israelis' concerns around taxes going to Hamas, to the authorities, and hence the income or the input of commercial has come down dramatically. Second is that we have a completely different operating environment inside Gaza. We have, throughout the crisis, been managing basically 3 operating environments. One where the authorities are still present. To be frank with you, that has been the easiest environment to operate in. Then there is the environment where IDF has ongoing operations. That has been a very challenging environment. You might have heard about discussions around deconfliction. That has not always worked. Our cars, our trucks have been hit on occasion, but that has also improved, and we've had a lot of discussions with the Israelis how that can improve. And then there has been a third environment, which is basically where there are no authorities, no ongoing operations, but frankly where there is a complete breakdown of law and order, Wild West chaos. That area has been limited so far, mainly in the south around Kerem Shalom and in some other pointed areas, but not throughout. And so we've been able to manage that quite well. Now, what has changed dramatically over the past 6 weeks is that that is now the norm throughout. And so, now the issue is not getting to the border or getting across the border, it's getting from that border to our warehouses and to distribution. We have been working very hard with the Israelis to open up new gates further north from Kerem Shalom so that we could take a safer route once we enter the strip. It took us, so we created a new bridge, we built some new roads, we opened up that gate finally after some 4 weeks of working hard. The first day it worked, the second day we were looted again. So, I want to really stress that since a couple of weeks only, we are in a completely new environment. We are being looted everywhere across the Gaza Strip, and frankly, in and around our warehouses, and now also moving from warehouses to distribution. We can accept a certain level of loss, but not 100%, then it certainly doesn't make any sense. And it's not the kind of desperate people that pull things from our trucks, which was very much the case at the beginning. It is organized gangs. We don't have any evidence that this would be in any way allowed or organized by the de facto authorities. On the contrary, on a number of occasions they have stepped in. The Israelis have also tried to step in on a couple of occasions. Here we certainly think that they could have done more to prevent this. But it is organized gangs, families, what have you, who are now gotten their hands on this, linked to the fact that the commercial has tightened down, because that means now that prices have come up. So, a couple of months ago it didn't make sense to steal a bag of wheat. Now it does, because that bag of wheat is so much more expensive. I'll stop here, but just to say that this is as we enter the winter. And so while last winter was tough, people were still staying mostly in apartments, though there could be 5-6 families in one apartment. Now we have 1 million people on the beach outside Khan Yunis in very poor shelter. And when the rains hit, it started raining over the weekend. Fortunately, it hasn't been as much rain so far, but when the cold come, we will have a much more dramatic humanitarian situation than we did last winter. And on top of that, of course, much less access to food, and frankly, the health situation, the situation around water and sanitation is unexplainable, and it's just a matter of time until we have an epidemic as well in Gaza. So that's a snapshot from where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Carl. You describe a situation of total despair, and therefore I cannot help but ask David, with his decades-long experience in the most nasty conflicts in the world. You heard Carl. No humanitarian corridors, very little deconfliction mechanisms, disregard for the very basic rules of international humanitarian law by all warring parties. Is there any advice you can give? Are there any references from other conflicts on not only what should be done, what could be done, and what the international community, Italy, the European Union, the United States, others could do in this situation in order to help people like CAR to comply with their mission?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the first thing I would say is to salute the amazing work done by Carl's colleagues and the others who try to provide assistance on the ground. The only point I think I would add to what Carl said is all this is completely unnecessary and completely imposed by the invading force. There's no reason that the health care system should collapse. There's no reason that anybody should be hungry. Everybody who has died but completely unnecessarily of hunger. It's imposed. And it's not even that any of this is hidden from the world. Minister Galland said they were going to cut off all the food going in. And so I agree with everything Carl said. But when Carl, you say, we've been working hard to open a new crossing and we managed to get Ashdod up. And what you're saying is that the Israelis, to call a spade, backed off from actually letting everybody starve to death on a massive scale under a certain amount of international scrutiny. I served in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the war, where twice as many people were killed as in Gaza, and not many more, actually, more like 3 times. But and nobody died of starvation. It's absolutely man-made and engineered. So I would say that point's important, and I'm not doing it to call out Israel. I have to say, I think we're going to get onto Sudan and Syria and Myanmar. I mean, frankly, the war against the population is the mode of warfare we are in now. And I think unless international humanitarian law is not a framework for the parties, where it is possible to do anything at all, it is by appealing to the interests of the parties. And I fear that the way to stop the humanitarian suffering is to get a ceasefire. But there has been this charade around the ceasefire, the truce for hostages ceasefire. But I don't think, as we look back on it, there was really any interest, particularly on the Israeli side, in getting an agreement. I mean, every time you would get close to an agreement, then they would say, oh, what about the Philadelphia corridor? The goalposts, as Antony Blinken, who was in Rome today, said. I mean, it's they who move the goalposts. So I would just say, yes, I all agree that, but we mustn't normalize it by treating it like a drought or by some sort of natural phenomenon. We have created this, and not just in Gaza. Most of the wars going on around the world, from Sudan to Myanmar, are some version of this.
Thank you, David. When there's no more respect for international law and where state structures don't apply, very often religious communities can play a role. Therefore, let me turn to Bishop Gallagher. Faith-based organizations, there are some Christians in Gaza, not so many, but it should be mentioned that it's not a totally Hamas-inspired place, so to say. There are other communities. What does the Catholic Church, let's say, know about Gaza? Which kind of advice you would give? Is there anything that you have learned in other conflicts that could help us to get more access for humanitarians and more supplies for the people in need in the Gaza Strip and in similar situations?
Thank you. Well, you're quite right to say that the number of Christians, number of Catholics is quite limited. There is one parish with a centre, and obviously the church around the world has been making efforts to provide humanitarian support, financial support to them, and hopefully that would, working out from there, that would be of benefit for many more people. But I think that apart from that, which is obviously extremely important, I think what we have tried to focus on, whether it's us here in Rome or the other Christians, Catholic leaders, church leaders in general throughout the region, is to try and to give to the Christian people the support, spiritual support, psychological support that they need in order to be able to influence the situation, in order to be able to persevere in something which is a very difficult situation. It's well known that the Pope tries every evening to speak to the parish priest of Gaza on the phone. And sometimes he can't get through, but he tries to do that just to keep people's spirits up, to encourage them, and which I think probably is as important as other forms of assistance and of aid. So I think that's what we've been focusing on, largely because of our limited, but the Caritas network and federation has been making very significant contributions from Jordan, from Egypt, and that over these months.
Thank you very much. And I think we all know from our own lives that when the situation is really, really awesome and difficult, awful, sorry, then hope is the most important element that you can suffer for a certain time, but if you're losing hope, then you lose all. So I think in that respect, the spiritual dimension is particularly important. Sarah, I hope that with your help we can perhaps still speak about Gaza, but also look at the more general situation on humanitarian challenges. Yeah, obviously the microphone has problems. Obviously, we are all very much focused on the humanitarian plight of the people of Gaza, but let's not forget that the MENA region and the Mediterranean is unfortunately home to some of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. There's still Syria, which we haven't yet talked a lot about at this conference, the crisis in Yemen, the crisis in Sudan, which now probably, in terms of numbers of affected people, is dwarfing even Gaza. It might be less visible in the media, but from a humanitarian point of view and from a crisis point of view, it's probably not less acute. How do you describe the situation, and what you think we could do as the powers that support and the organizations that support humanitarian supplies in order to help in a better way so that people can keep hope?
Thanks, Michael. Let me start with Gaza, because I want to add some numbers to what Carl said. Numbers focus minds. So for those who are not familiar with some of the technical aspects of humanitarian action, we classify the levels of food insecurity. And when you get to level 5, or what is called integrated phase classification, IPC, that is basically a famine condition. While 70% of people in Gaza are at level 5. That is famine condition, right? And the vast majority of people in Gaza are young people. So in plain language, it means that a lot of children are starving in Gaza. Now, Gaza is a place where before the 6th of October last year, 500 trucks of food aid were going in every day. Between the 1st of October and the 31st of October, 37 trucks have gone in. Just think the difference, you know? These are people that were dependent on that support, and the support has plummeted so dramatically that there is no way people can be kept alive. And as David said, you know, parties in conflict have an obligation to allow humanitarian assistance, and occupying power has an affirmative obligation to do so, and this is not happening. Now, this is a problem because the violations of international humanitarian law we're seeing in Gaza actually have repercussions, have reverberations in all the other conflicts. There is a lot of, you know, we hear a lot on the media in all kinds of conversations about the fact that international humanitarian law is not being upheld. And there's a lot of casual talk about international humanitarian law. Without being, you know, too specific, international humanitarian law exists to affirm humanity in the midst of a conflict. You know, it's there to give us a moral compass when a war is being fought. It's important to mitigate the worst excesses of fighting a war. And that's why it's so important to preserve international humanitarian law. It really is, you know, about us as human beings towards other human beings, even when we're fighting a war. And we're seeing every possible aspect of international humanitarian law being violated in Gaza, in a context that is so high profile and where so many powerful states are associating, are seen as abetting these violations. And this is the real problem, that a lot of third parties are seen as complicit in the violations that we're seeing in Gaza. And so how do you hold belligerents in Sudan, in Syria, in Myanmar, anywhere else, to the obligations that they have according to Geneva Conventions, when we're seeing them flagrantly breached day in, day out, without the same pronouncements, the same, call to the belligerents to respect the obligations that we normally see in other contexts. So this has become so problematic because the double standards in applying the law are under the eyes of everyone. And the fact that, Europe, the US, a lot of, states that are, that purport to be defenders of the rules-based system are not speaking out, it's really problematic. Now, this is in the context of the law. Obviously, people try and survive despite violation of international humanitarian law, try to find ways to, to cope in the worst possible situations. And what we're seeing everywhere in Gaza, in Sudan, in Syria, in Myanmar, is what local respondents are doing. You talk about Sudan, and in a way, the numbers in Sudan way dwarf the numbers of Gaza. We have 22 million people at risk of famine in Sudan, so way more than in Gaza. We're seeing a situation that is just shocking. And yet we're seeing local respondents organizing soup kitchens, all sorts of provision at the local level with really nothing. An operation on the ground, that is led by the so-called emergency response rooms, that is actually admirable and that really provides an opportunity for a different type of humanitarian action being provided. But the system, the international humanitarian system, they is stuck in its ways and is not able to support financially and operationally what Sudanese civil society, Sudanese citizens are doing themselves. We can go in detail if you want, but I think this is where the big challenge today to international humanitarian action is. On one hand is the law, on the other hand is a system that is no longer fit for purpose and is unable to find way to support the modes of response that are actually effective, that provide a way forward, but too many vested interests are holding us back from enabling them.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for always showing us a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel by indicating the competence of local organizations and their willingness to act. Now, I think you opened two big sets of questions there. First, what can we do practically? And secondly, how can we come back to more respect for international humanitarian law? And I wanted to ask Carl and David on these aspects. Carl, of course, WFP is working also in Syria for many, many years and in Sudan. Is there any best practice that you can draw from these experiences? Is there anything that you can recommend? For example, would humanitarian corridors work? Or how can you convince the warring parties in both conflicts, probably in Syria more than in Sudan, to somehow show a little bit of respect to certain rules that allow you to operate on the ground?
I don't know. I mean, every context is unique. So I guess, the lesson learned we have is that we need to be creative and we need to draw on experiences from across, but that every context is unique. I mean, if we talk about Sudan, we had a situation where it was basically our most popular family duty station in Khartoum. Everyone had their children in Khartoum and in Sudan, and everyone had brought all their belongings. Overnight, that dramatically changed. We had a traumatic evacuation through Port Sudan. Our 1,200 national staff were all displaced outside or inside Sudan, and everyone lost everything in a matter of a couple of weeks. Obviously, that was a shock to us and to the system. On top of that, what was the backbone of the international, or at least the UN presence, was a mission that was also kicked out a few weeks later. So obviously a massive shock to our presence to the system. Embassies have the luxury then to relocate to Nairobi or to go even back to Stockholm or wherever. We, of course, tried to get back on our feet and start assisting also the civilians impacted by this fighting. But I think it's fair to say that it took some time. And once we were beginning to get back on our feet, Gaza happened, and all the attention, all the energy, all the oxygen in the room went somewhere else. And so, you know, I think we are now throwing everything we have on Sudan, I must say. We have our best people. We are trying all kinds of modalities, from cross-border to cross-line food, but also through cash, tapping into I mean, it's fair to say, if it wasn't for the Sudanese themselves, it would have been much worse, whether it is remittances coming from outside or these local communities coming together. And so we're trying to tap into that system and see how the international system can, in one hand, complement, but also fuel those national or local solutions. So we're throwing all the people, the ideas, and internal resources we can at Sudan. And why we do that is that, you know, when I look across, if there is one context still where there is a margin between what we're doing and what we can do, that is Sudan. And that's not only for us, but certainly we are determined to tap that gap. Sudan, Syria, you asked about Syria, is a bit different. The real issue is funding. There is no funding whatsoever for Syria, despite the fact that, you know, some additional 400,000 people have arrived into communities where there was already a crisis. So in a way, it's a crisis on top of a crisis. UNHCR, on behalf of all of us, launched an appeal. I think there's been a 10% response to that appeal. Nothing to compare with Gaza or Lebanon, but really funding is the main issue for Syria. And if I end off just quickly on Lebanon, where we have also scaled up quite quickly, frankly, I must say we were prepared because we had seen this coming, obviously. But having been there a couple of weeks ago, what I left with was really a deep concern for you know, the challenge this has posed to the already fragile social fabric in Lebanon. We need to watch that extremely carefully, and in the system that we provide, make sure that we, for sure, not fuel any divisions, but also try to mitigate, including assisting local communities as much as we can in our support.
And part of the crisis of international humanitarian aid is obviously a lack of funding. You sense it very much, especially at WFP, because WFP has, of course, one big donor that represents more than 40% of the funding, and this donor has now a change of administration, so we shall see. But David, you know, 2 years ago at the UN panel, I said, well, we speak about IHL. That means international humanitarian law. It doesn't mean international humanitarian nice to have. It's law. It's binding. States have signed up to it. They have signed conventions. You can go to court over that. And still what we see is a blatant disregard for the rules of international law all over the place. Go to Ukraine, go to the east of Congo, go to Syria, now in Gaza. Let's not even speak about Sudan. Could you still recommend a young student who wants to enroll at university to study international law with a focus on international law, or that's simply a lost cause? Or how can we bring back a little bit of respect for it and fight the sense of impunity? This is not an academic question, because if powers, including armed non-state actors, don't respect international humanitarian law, it means aid workers are being killed, and that's what we see on a daily basis in so many conflicts, also in Gaza, obviously. Do you have any hope for us?
Yeah, I have a little hope, but I would say it's as bad as you say. I mean, I think, frankly, there is more or less total impunity, whether it's Myanmar or Sudan or Gaza or many of the other wars, the Ukraine. I think impunity is the name of the game. I would say it's also, I mean, just to start with the really bad, not limited to international humanitarian law. I would say norms, laws, principles, alliances, you know, the fairly fragile and imperfect web that has kept our world together since 1945 is basically falling apart. And I think IHL is just a part of that, Gaza is a part of that, but it's an essentially global phenomenon. If I have to end, you know, as one should, you know, what can be done in very dark times? While I think norms, principles, laws, institutions are largely out, there are ways of appealing to naked self-interest, and we live in a time of naked self-interest that can be put to the public use. I mean, You and I have talked about the Black Sea grain deal. So what is interesting about the Black Sea grain agreement, which really did bring world food prices, grain prices down by about 25% at a critical moment when, across the world, but particularly in parts of the world that were most affected by food shortage. What was interesting about it was there was no appeal to IHL or to people's better interests or anything. It was crudely transactional. And, I have nothing against any of these parties, but Ukraine wanted to be able to export. Russia thought it would block it, but then it noticed that the people who were most affected by the rising price were the only people in the world who supported Putin's invasion. So it was the presidents in Africa and the Middle East, and eventually in June of 2022, the Chinese, who weighed in and said, Russia, you've got to do it. There are deals that are possible. At about the same time, the end of the Tigray War, which was probably, in raw human death terms, one of the worst wars of modern times. Hundreds of thousands of people, according to the Uppsala conflict database, died in that war. What is interesting is that the deals that are possible seem to have two aspects. One is they are hybrid. And when I say hybrid, they don't involve formal international organizations, except insofar as they might be part of a hybrid mix. They are a minestrone soup. So the Black Sea Grain Initiative was Russia and Ukraine. There was an NGO, the center I work with. There were the insurance agencies were key players. Turkey, a powerful regional state, and the UN that was required to wrap it up. I should say Cardinal Zuppi played a nice little role on the side from the background. But what's interesting is they are completely hybrid, ad hoc, nobody standing on any principle, everybody just seeing what can be done. Tigray is a little bit the same. Also, there was an NGO, a regional organization. The United States came in as a country. So I do think these are very bad times indeed for the whole normative structure that has kept the world more or less together since 1945. But from that mess emerges some practice on which we have to build. And my feeling is that in all of these places, Gaza, now Lebanon, Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine, there are these opportunistic hybrid arrangements that can reduce human suffering at least a bit.
And that, of course, absolutely leads me to Bishop Gallagher, because you represent a unique body, which is a faith-based organization. At the same time, you're a subject of international law. You have your seat in the United Nations. You are a diplomat, not only a bishop. What can the Vatican, what can the Holy See as a state do in its diplomacy to further the respect for international humanitarian law, to convince parties to come to these transactional deals? If it works to help people, then transaction is a good word. So with the wisdom of the Church's 2,000 years of experience, what can you advise us to do?
Well, I think that what you said it yourself at the end of my last intervention, is keeping hope alive in people's hearts. I think also one of the things that we are trying to do is to keep talking to as many people as we can, because that is the tendency for people to isolate themselves and to not to bother to talk. And I think that that's part of the problem of the lawlessness that we have today, that there is too much to think, well, we keep the rules only when it suits us, or when it's convenient for us, and for the rest of the time we do what we like. I think the other thing that we're very acutely aware is that the longer these conflicts go on, the further they extend, we have a dehumanizing experience for us, for men and women throughout the world. And at the same time as we fear that these wars are generating generations of people who are going to seek revengeance, who are going to try and to put what they consider to be wrong right in a violent way. What we have to do is to see that the humanization, we have to sort of struggle with our humanity. And I think that is part of the problem is that we've been talking about some of these conflicts. The truth is that an awful lot of the world's sufferings and its conflicts are forgotten. They don't appear in the news. They don't appear on our screens. And we have to get people to look at their humanity and to realize that our humanity is in danger and that we are in the danger of becoming exactly what, in one sense, we're fighting against. And that is a real threat to the future of humanity. It's a real threat to our personal integrity as well. So I think that's the sort of thing that we're trying to do in our diplomacy, in our contacts with people, in our engagement with people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. I think we have been very well analyzing a very sad picture right now. And I'm really grateful to Sarah that she already gave us one, not way out, but one way of how we could do better. Because I think what you all said in your contributions, whether speaking about Gaza or other crises in the region, is that we have a real problem in the existing humanitarian system, which has delivered great over decades. It has saved millions of lives, but now we come more and more to kind of an impasse. The system is underfunded. It doesn't succeed in many cases to bring the assistance to the people who are in need, and the rules on which the system is based are more and more openly disregarded. Perhaps not questioned in theory, but in practice less and less observed. So what do we need to do except complaining about the situation? You already mentioned the power of local organizations. Of course, we have to continue asking states and other actors in war, including in the MENA region, to comply with what they have committed to, which is, for example, IHL. But at the same time, can the humanitarian system become more astute? Are there ways out? How does the system need to change to be better fit for purpose? Would you have any advice, Sarah?
Well, plenty, but we don't have enough time, so I'll try and summarize it. But these are things that my organization has been, writing about, analyzing for a very long time. If people are really interested in this, I recommend one old report now that we wrote in 2016, just before the World Humanitarian Summit, that was titled "Time to Let Go." And I think the title says it all. It was really an exhortation to the international humanitarian system to let go of the ways in which it operates. And it starts from analyzing the fact that there is a crisis of legitimacy for the system as it is today. A system that was created, if you want, on the back of the end of the Second World War, at the time of US and European hegemony, with, if you want, a lot of Western bias built in it, with a lot of people reject. And a system that has become incredibly expensive. So when we talk about funding and sort of having not enough funding, I always say, is it the funding? When people say, the needs, we can't meet the needs, I say, we can't meet the needs of the system or the needs of the people. Because the system has become so expensive that especially, in the context of fiscally constrained environments, it's impossible to keep it going. And we've tried to reform this system for the best part of 20 years. But, as I always say, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than trying to build the most seaworthy vessel. There is a lot of very technocratic reforms that we try to apply, but we're not reforming the incentives. And the system's incentives are all about growth. Growth in numbers, growth in the number of people, staff, and growth in the numbers of, sort of funding the international organizations attract themselves, but the UN agencies and the INGOs. And that's where the problem is, because we have built all the wrong incentives in the system. The incentive should be about having deeper impact, supporting action that really, gets people the support that they need in the most efficient and effective way. We know that in the vast majority, first of all, the vast majority of humanitarian crises are protracted. They go on for, 10 years or more. That is 84% of humanitarian funding goes to protracted crisis. We continue to respond with a system that is very short-term, input-driven, year-on-year appeals. People, after the first 6 months of an acute crisis, they want education and support for jobs and livelihoods. That's the two things the humanitarian system doesn't support, because it doesn't fit with our humanitarian categories. There is so much that needs to change, but we're not changing it because humanitarian careers have been built on a system that rewards trying to bring more money, try to increase the size of the organization. We need to change fundamentally. That's why the title of the report was Time to Let Go, because it was about an exhortation to the system to let go of the power and the control that the international organizations exert in the system. And national actors are not the panacea, are not the only response. But definitely we need to find a better complementarity. It's also not about throwing the baby away with the bathwater, because we need international organization. We need international organization for the normative side to really make sure that we continue to contribute to the normative side. We need them because there is a lot of expertise that's been built into the system, but we don't need them the way they are today. We need them to be complementary, to be supportive of the local action and national action, to actually specialize more on the acute phase, which is really where you need that extra support. But as crises become protracted, it is really the local civil society, the citizens that need to drive that response. You know better than me, how much this is being discussed, but the way the Grand Bargain was trying to pick some of those elements, but my fear when the Grand Bargain was first established in Istanbul was that, again, Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. You've got the big organizations there trying to negotiate with the donors and not making the changes that are really required. And I said from the beginning, you need 2 or 3 donors, maybe even 1 or 2, that really has the courage to show that things can be done differently, that will support local action in a different way, that will support cash, that will support a lot of more efficient instruments, and that will start demanding of the international organizations that they work in a more complementary way. And then maybe we'll see things starting to change. There is a lot of expertise and wisdom built in many years of the system becoming better, but we need to use it differently. And we need to do that really, it's urgent, because people are losing faith in the system as it is. And that is the worst thing, that we become an irrelevance. And then we can't even bring all the positives that we have built over so many years.
I just imagine Carl going back to his office in the afternoon in Mariana and saying to his people, well, if I understood Sarah correctly, she told us to pack up. As a practitioner, as somebody who unfortunately works for the established system, which is a very honorable thing to do, what is your way to the future? How can we do better in Gaza and beyond?
Well, maybe I misunderstood, but it was not really my takeaway. But I certainly, it's a system that needs change. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we're facing in my view, two sets of challenges. One is the gap that we have talked about. We just launched our outlook for next year. We're expecting some 350 million people to be acutely food insecure. That's not counting the chronically food insecure. So 350 million. 4 years ago, our estimate was 150 million. So that's more than double in only 4 years, driven by conflict, not least, but also the extreme weather events we see from climate change. Our budget remains more or less the same. It's still significant, but it's more or less the same. So the challenge here is how do we reach more than twice the need with the same resource? I mean, one answer is diversification of our funding base, and here I think we can do much more, but it's also to think about funding differently. It doesn't have to be $1 into WFP and food or $1 out. It can also be using us as a platform to facilitate capital that has impact on food security. Second is certainly on efficiency effectiveness. We need to spend less on ourselves and more on the people we serve. And so, I think the system as a whole needs to, really reflect on what we can bring to the table in terms of efficiencies. And finally, what Sarah spoke to about how do we, contribute to solutions much more, in partnership, not least with communities and governments, but also with others, and not chase after their needs, but really try to see how we can push back on those needs and certainly avoid needs from growing. But the second set of challenges is really this new political environment, this unhinged political environment that we're trying to navigate. And I mean, we spoke at length about the challenges we are facing in our operations, but frankly also, we have an increasingly complex donor environment with increasing conditionalities and agendas that are imposed on us that are quite unreasonable. And I think to navigate that is more difficult, but I think, from one side, we need to be consistent in how we apply our principles. We can't do one thing in Gaza and another thing in Ukraine and a third in Sudan. We need to try to be consistent as a system and work together in that consistency so that also it's not UNHCR doing one thing and WFP another. Secondly, I think we need to be completely transparent. We can't be in the business of doing deals behind doors or under the table. Actors, whether they are donors or actors on the ground, need to know that, when we find ways, we do so transparently. We often choose between bad options. There are dilemmas because we are really trying to, save lives. And when we do then things that, on the face of it won't make sense, maybe we need to be completely transparent and explain why we are entering into that way. And finally, as a UN organization, we need to do more in terms of tapping into the multilateral nature. Relate to member states more broadly. I mean, in the past, it's been very much a donor and kind of program country relationship. We need to broaden that and to have completely different kinds of relations with countries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Brazil or what have you, what is relevant to these contexts. And I think that's something for humanitarian organizations really to invest in going forward.
Thank you very much. In the last 5 minutes, I first wanted to give the floor to Bishop Gallagher and to David Harlan, but then at the end I will ask you, all of you, to answer one question with just one sentence. So I prepare you mentally already. But first, Bishop Gallagher and also David afterwards, the crisis of humanitarian aid is actually linked to other crises. It's linked to a crisis of the UN system, it's a crisis of rules-based order, of multilateralism. The world seems to be more in turmoil than it has been before in the last 30, 40 years at least. What needs to be done? Is there something, so to say, that we should do right now in order not just suffer the consequences of these multifold crises, but somehow create hope, not only for people, but for the international system? Bishop.
Well, I entirely agree that there is an enormous credibility deficit at the moment. People are very critical of institutions, critical of democracy, and these are the things that are presenting us with major challenges. With regard to credibility, I think that there are some things which are inevitable. There will always be natural disasters that will provoke humanitarian situations which need a response. But there are quite a lot of our present crises which we could say that could be anticipated. And I think one thing which would help restore confidence in the multilateral system and in humanitarian would be if we could adopt a more of an attitude, let's do today really what we can do, and not put it off for tomorrow or the day after on that thing. And I think that is a natural tendency within many institutions, including my own. But I think it's something which we do have to fight against.
That's a very pragmatic approach. David.
Somebody once said, was it Alice in Wonderland, that lessons are called lessons because they lessen and lessen? We simply have to understand the nature of the system that is passing, what does work, and invest in it. And, frankly, I think all this decline of norms, laws, principles, alliances is basically a function of the relative decline of American power. I mean, for better or for worse, the American empire of 1945 on was an empire of principles and institutions. I mean, they didn't always follow their own principles, but that was the framework. We are now actually reverting to a more normal world. Carl used the word creative, and Sarah used the word realistic. You know, we just need to draw from what works rather than pretend that a framework isn't there. I don't think your student who goes to university, yes, I would encourage the student to go to that university. It's in the hard times that we need the smartest young people thinking about the way out. But the lesson is we can't continue the way we have for 80 years.
Thank you. Now I would like to confront you, just to wrap up, with my favorite question. I apologize to Bishop Gallagher because what I'm asking is not a very Catholic thought. Just imagine that after a full day and with a lot of depressing news, your analysis of the plights of the humanitarian system and the plights of the people, which is more important, tonight you have still good sleep, but then, you know, between 1 and 2 o'clock, there comes the famous fairy. And the fairy tells you, Carl, David, Sarah, Ray, you have not 3 wishes, you have 1 wish. 1 wish to bring the humanitarian system out of jeopardy and to help people in Gaza, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Lebanon, and so many other places better. What is this 1 wish? Carl.
I mean, I don't think it's for the humanitarian system. My wish would be for people like David and those in peacemaking to be more effective so that we can end these wars and to prevent new ones from arising. That would be my wish.
I could imagine David has a wish for WFP now. But David?
I have the same wish, but for Carl.
Sarah.
I wish to dispense of the notion of a system and help everyone see that we can contribute to advancing humanity. That is at the heart of humanitarian action. We can all be, and we all are, humanitarian respondents. We need to dispense of this idea that is the system that needs to do it.
And Bishop, in your case, it's not the fairy, but you can pray, obviously. So what would be your prayer?
My prayer would be that we resist the temptation to become insensitive to the sufferings of others and to think that the sufferings of others is not the same as our own suffering. Thank you.
That's a deeply human and humanitarian thought. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we won the Nobel Peace Prize here in this discussion. And we didn't do a lot to help people in Gaza and beyond. But I would still like you to applaud these people who every day spend their time to help people in dire need. Thank you so much.
There you go, David.